Greetings, reference getters. Today we'll be taking a dive into Pokémon Crystal. For those who don't know, this game is an absolute masterpiece. Downright the greatest game on the Game Boy Color. Today we'll be taking a look at this absolute gem from a different angle, as giving a normal critique of this game just isn't going to cut it, as Crystal's offering recycles a lot of what Gold and Silver previously was. And as we all know, there's only so much that you can do to improve on perfection. So today, we will see how they did just that. And to do that, this critique is divided into two parts. One, where I recap Gold and Silver as to avoid copy-pasting all the wonderful praise I had for those games, so we know exactly what this experience recreates. And then secondly, what Crystal adds to the equation to make this game skyrocket up the tier list of all. Yes, sir! So, before we can talk about Crystal itself, we need to do a quick recap of Gold and Silver, since it'll outline how Pokémon Crystal is built from top to bottom, before seeing what's new and how big or small the improvements actually are. But as a reminder, Pokémon Gold and Silver's gameplay was segmented between two different regions, but more importantly, two distinct parts of the game rather than having one giant slab of game, which is a phenomenal concept, hurt by sloppy execution, as the game's also focused on a non-linear approach, allowing for you to do a large handful of the game's gyms in any order you would like. But again, just like the two-region premise, it was a good idea, but the execution was not thrilling, as it took a concept that was supposed to help the game's replayability and somehow found a way to make it do the exact opposite. Because in execution, the games ended up very unfulfilling, due to roughly 60% of the game feeling like it had either no progression, a lack of quality content, or any exciting gameplay moments at all. Although most of these issues come at the hand of the level curve, as the level curve provided for the games absolutely did not work. Not at all during the second half, where only two trainers even remotely felt like a continuation off of the champion after beating the first half of the game. So for the first part of the game, the level curve kind of works for it, having a horrible slowdown during the mid-game that's not even funny, but of course that's just the trainers. When wild Pokemon gets taken into consideration, it's laughable in Johto, and Kanto, it's just a cruel joke, which completely removed any point in picking up any new Pokemon in Kanto due to them being so drastically under-leveled, forcing you to grind a not okay amount of levels to even get them to catch up to where they should be, pretty much forcing you to do all of your team building in Johto, arbitrarily warping your team building. But if that wasn't bad enough, the Pokemon variety is problematic. Not even looking at the wild encounters, a handful of the Pokemon that can be gotten in Johto weren't even able to evolve until Kanto due to horrible item placement, making the worst strain on team building that surprisingly has not been matched since. Keeping the experience muddy is the fact those games just lacked any real form of post-game. That, bundled with the lack of side content, leaves the experience pretty dry and gasping for air once you've beaten Red. Although it was not perfect, Gold and Silver did, however, bring a handful of important changes and additions to the core gameplay experience for both the overworld and in battles alike, flesh out the core gameplay, which was previously pretty barren and pretty flawed. And finally, the story was just sort of fine. The rival arc wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was decent. Meanwhile, bringing back Team Rocket was just so damn lame, and nothing came out of it other than disappointment, and the nostalgia we hoped for was just us getting spit in the face, as it amounted to nothing. The only story note, if you can even call it one, to not actually be bad is the protagonist of the previous game showing up just out of nowhere to be the final boss. Pretty neat. Overall, the package provided by Gold and Silver was good in concept, but in execution, it is not a thrilling experience to go back and actually play through. This recap is important as it lays the foundation for what Crystal provides, as just so much of it goes unchanged or is slightly improved. And of course, I'm not going to sit here and repeat the entirety of the Gold and Silver video. I never would have thought about doing that idea. Which now begs the question, what does Pokémon Crystal even provide? In a short meme answer, just a female player option in the Battle Tower, but in actuality, a little bit more, and of course we're going to jump feet first into the unimpressive pool of content called Pokémon Crystal. Now up first is the biggest addition to the game, being the quest for Suicune, because of course they'd give the random one Pokemon of a legendary trio special treatment for some reason. Now the changes begin starting at the 4th gym, as you can't actually battle the gym until after you do some new story event at the Burn Tower, which not only forces a previously optional rival battle, but introduces you to Yucine, who is a man obsessed with Suicune. He's pretty useless in the grand scheme of things. You end up setting Suicune free, and guess what? Nothing happens. Now, other than a pointless battle later with him, these 3 extra pots of EXP, and a minor lore dump, the only real change of note here is the legendary Pokemon. as after the radio tower event you can go catch Suicune as a regular legendary encounter, thankfully ridding it of its awful roamer status, unlike Entei and Raikou, who are still suffering. But a new issue lies beneath the surface. Ho-Oh. Like in Pokemon Gold, Lugia is blocked off until a certain point in Kanto, but Ho-Oh on the other hand was evicted of its status of being obtainable during Johto, and is instead after the Pokemon League. So far, not bad. But to get the Rainbow Wing, you have to catch all 3 of the legendary cats. Remember, Suicune was moved, which is fine. However, Raikou and Entei were not. So thanks to their roamer status, you'll only ever catch one of them at best, costing you your Master Ball, and then surprise, you're never going to catch the other one, and in turn, never catch Ho-Oh as well. Look at that, one minor improvement with a minor trade-off. Fun. Ultimately, the story edition hardly does anything for the game's identity or the narrative itself, but at least helps to make the level curve slightly, and I cannot stress this enough, slightly better. Since we were already on the track of the Pokemon you can use in the game, let's continue. One of the biggest issues in team building with Gold and Silver has been addressed, being the stone evolutions that were previously locked to Kanto, as now you can actually get access to them before battling the Pokemon League. However, despite being able to get them, an issue arises in how you get them, of course. It's tied to RNG through the Pokegear's phone calls. Ugh. Despite being tied to an obnoxious time-wasting mechanic, it does help a lot being able to use those stone evolution Pokemon before the second half of the game. And being able to get more than one is massive as well, solving a problem that never should have existed at all. Now that we've solved the issue with the Pokemon that were already obtainable before Kanto, now we can look at new Pokemon gotten in Johto. Now, obviously excluding the game's odd roster of Pokemon that cannot be obtained in Crystal because version exclusives, the Wild Encounter pool sees a few Pokemon obtained during the first act that previously wasn't. Now, the size of this list is impressive, but the list includes Sneasel. Yep, that's literally it. The one Pokemon most infamously screwed over by the game's mechanics is the only Pokemon that they had the decency to move to mainland Johto before the Pokemon League in the wild. Truly disgusting. But wait, you can potentially cheat the system once through the Odd Egg to gain access to Pichu, Elekid, or Cleffa long before they're ever made available to the player. Or you'll waste time hatching an egg just for it to be an Igglybuff, Tyrogue, Smoochum, or Magby, being effectively useless even if the egg has increased shiny odds, because you're going to want to make use of the 3 Pokemon previously locked at Kanto, rather than just picking up something that was already obtainable in Johto. But that's it! Excluding Lugia and Ho-Oh, which we've previously mentioned, being pushed to the game's second act, we've looked at all the Pokemon altered in their availability. To summarize, because it's a mess, all of the Pokemon that evolve through stones, Sneasel, and one of Pichu, Cleffa, or Elekid can be gotten before beating the Pokemon League, all at the cost of the 2 legendaries being delayed. Overall, it's a solid trade-off, as the Pokemon selection you can use is greater, which will of course improve the game's replayability. While I don't say it much, replayability is one of Pokemon's strongest qualities. That is made of both the Pokemon selection and the game's pacing, and if the battles granted are even worthwhile. Which means it's time to talk about the battles now, huh? Oh yes, ladies and gentlemen, the trainer changes. This is the part where Gold and Silver dropped the ball the hardest. Basically, the Pokemon variety on trainers' teams was poor. The level curve needlessly goes nowhere halfway through Johto, and then just is never able to catch back up. And it's even made worse by the EXP drought Johto suffers prior to the Pokemon League. And then Kanto's trainer levels are just horrific, where generic trainer levels were rarely even compared to the Elite Fours, while only a single gym leader goes higher than the champion's team level-wise. And all of this is supposed to be a natural progression in the game, but instead it just fizzles out, leaving the entire Kanto arc very uneventful and very unfulfilling to play through. Oh yeah, then there's Red and his dummy over-leveled team for a final challenge. And another grind wall. Overall, Gold and Silver's trainers were not thrilling, and made the game a bit of a snorefest. And Kanto, specifically, was in desperate need of an overhaul. And so you ask, how did Crystal address the level curve? Well, a very small amount of trainers were added to the game, at least making EXP slightly more accessible, although ignoring the quality of the pre-existing trainers for some reason. But there's another important question for you to ask. The gym leaders, they got fixed, right? Well, of course, Buttercup. Why wouldn't they? They fixed the level crisis in the mid-game, Kanto's leaders got a massive level increase to not be complete pushovers, and Johto's leaders finally got decent Pokemon on their teams, is what I would say if this wasn't complete and utter misinformation, as there wasn't even a single noticeable change to any of the gym leaders going into Crystal. The levels are the same, the Pokemon are the same, and the movesets are the same, as a simple copy and paste was performed, which is ironic as people called Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl Pearl Lazy. Meanwhile, this is just a carbon copy with no noticeable adjustments. But no, it's fine, man. There's no double standards here. It leaves the most important part of the gameplay relatively boring, as you're either grinding for a bad EXP curve or walking all over the game's pathetic trainers. Next is a few minor changes that help the world feel less barren and slightly more immersive, as a few locations had small adjustments. Notably, the Champions Room, the Ruins of Alph got a pointless expansion that actually rewards the player just a little bit for exploring, and this extra table in Professor Elm's lab, as well as the Dragon's Den getting a bit of an overhaul, as this building was made accessible to replace Claire's awful quest for the final badge. Basically, you do the same thing, but you go into the building instead to take a test. Other than the extreme speed Dratini, there's basically nothing here, other than the room looking neat. Also, I memed about this edition earlier, but Crystal finally added a female player option. Sadly, in this game, there is nothing notable that changes from playing the female player option, meaning it's purely cosmetic and nothing more. Speaking of being in the game and adding nothing, the game's Pokemon will actually have unique animations upon entering a battle, or of course being seen on the summary screen. Yep, it's just a small addition that slows down battles a tad bit. It's neat, but unnecessary, unlike the game actually telling you whenever you enter a new route or a town. Now that right there is some useful information, and a good addition. Sick! Time for the new side content, because of course, none of this is unlocked after beating Red, so no true post-game content. So now let's state the obvious, being the returning side content. The Game Corner, the Pokegear with a small upgrade we'll talk about later, room decoration, and the bug catching contest. Cool, we're all caught up now, which means new stuff. First, something actually being beneficial is a move tutor that only appears twice a week to teach a Pokemon one of 3 attacks, but sadly at the cost of coins from the Game Corner. Now it's a shame this is post-Elite 4, but let's be real, it's passable given the game's 2-act structure, and of course game balancing. Next is a new radio show on the Pokegear, a password show that rewards you with mediocre items for listening to the radio and relaying the password at the radio tower. Small, but kind of pointless. But much like Crystal itself, it's at least something. And finally, the greatest, most revolutionary piece of gameplay ever conceived, ever so graciously descended upon us, finally teaching us what good content is! The Battle Tower. Okay, I just want to know who the hell wrote this absolute cesspool of misinformation, because we all know the Battle Tower is just a gauntlet of 7 battles in a row, and it is nothing special at all. And we will never speak on it again, even if objectively its inclusion is good for the game. Alright, that's it for the side content. Congrats, we got essentially what was a pinch of salt's worth of content. And finally, Celebi. What was formerly an event is now a normal piece of the game in the 3DS version of Pokemon Crystal. After beating the Pokemon League, you can get the GS Ball for free in order to do the event to get this mythical Pokemon. At level 30, again after beating the champion. Overall a great addition, although once the 3DS eShop goes down, it'll surely become a problem for someone else, right? They added a backtracking trip after the 3rd gym, which previously did not exist, because they want to trap you here so you can play the game forever. But here's some phenomenal news. That was our last change this game brought to Gold and Silver's experience, which means it's time to end this. If that satirical intro wasn't enough to get the point across, Pokemon Crystal is a joke. Now, while it's a direct improvement to Gold and Silver, that is not saying much. However, unlike Pokemon Yellow, at least the list of flaws added to the game is significantly smaller in comparison. At least meaning, as a 3rd improved version, this game is pretty much objectively better than the original across the board. The way it should be. The game is no walking abomination. It's just mid, but if it aged poorly, which yes, can happen, and in this case, did happen. Meaning it's time to explain games simply aging and us not living in 2001 anymore, because apparently a wake-up call is needed if the Gold and Silver comment section suggested any ideas to me. Now, for the history lesson, Pokemon Crystal released in a good time, when standards were low and it did well, although as this video outlined, wasn't completely deserved, but that's just how it was back then. 10 years passed, and new games raised the bar, while mediocre ones were left behind. And then another 10 years pass, and the bar rises again, rinse and repeat, leading to most games taking a hit. It's a crazy idea, but it's also real. Revolutionary games happen, and years later, fall off, some harder than others. I've never been one to stand behind the idea of a game being phenomenal and staying that way years later just because of its legacy when better stuff has come out and these older games have their flaws perfectly exposed in broad daylight. Let's look at Red and Blue or Crystal for example, and then compare them to another set of games, Pokemon X and Y. X and Y are a major step up across the board on everything, but actually, it's worse because we're comparing comparing modern standards to old standards instead of grading everything based on the here and now. No, not all old games are bad. Some are still legendary to this day and hold up, and there's reasons to that. Yes, the old Pokemon games have aged poorly, but that's just because of the content in question. Gold and Silver are the perfect example of that. Unique mechanics are one thing, but a bloated game that's mostly unfulfilling across the board tried negatively challenging what made the formula work. Like the progression and the variety, which in turn hurt the game's replayability. They all got worse, and that is a sin, and what led them to not being good in the modern day, when of course the quality bar is much higher. Sure, it's unfair, but sadly, that's life. Pushing the Game Boy Color to the limits is cute, but ultimately it doesn't matter. Being the best game on a system piled with nothing games, and being the best by default doesn't invalidate the issues the game in question has. That idea both sounds and is ridiculous. All of this applies to Crystal since it's damn near the same experience in a way that feels insulting. Pokemon Crystal and Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl share traits with one another. A, they have a lack of purpose. Why does the game exist? What is the goal? B, they lack anything to set the games apart from the originals in any meaningful way. And C, they lack identity because they are the same game, but in a more literal sense of what Pokemon, Call of Duty, or the new Super Mario games were typically known for. Both games share one thing in common though, and that is the fact they are filler. Pokemon Crystal never needed to exist, after seeing many ways to fix the many abundant flaws present in Gold and Silver, but instead decided to actively ignore the big issues while changing very little, leading it to play damn near the exact same. It's a lot like playing Gold and Silver, but you decide to trade over a Clefable to use a Pokemon you couldn't use in those games. Regardless of what game you're playing, it's essentially identical, versus trading over a Houndoom to Pearl and then comparing it to Platinum. The experience between those two games is drastically different and justified Platinum existing because it wasn't just a carbon copy, with the smallest little minuscule addition known to man. Despite its issues, Gold and Silver needed to exist for reasons like the gameplay improvements. Yellow served the purpose of recreating a semi-anime experience, and played pretty different to Red and Blue. But Pokemon Crystal did nothing meaningful in changing how the games would go from start to finish. It is just a filler game and nothing more. Now, with all of that said, and how important the modern perspective is, should you play Pokemon Crystal? No. It's still a very weak Pokemon game in general, packed down once again with replayability issues in a series famed for its replayability. The remakes are right there, just in case you actually wanted to play Johto, and the version that actually fixed a chunk of Gold and Silver's issues rather than ignoring it. And for the score, 2.8 out of 10. Yes, despite being a better Gold and Silver, it's the same score because ultimately, despite the very, very small additions, it's the same in a way that makes Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl look inoffensive. Reference getters, I thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this circus, including the out-of-pocket rant where I indirectly criticized myself for foolishly thinking that a certain game needed to be on some kind of pedestal to score fairly in the grand context of gaming. It wasn't a rant for the sake of ranting, but more so stating how nostalgia and legacy are not the end-all be-all weapon when looking at games critically, and trying to find where a game lands as objectively as one can try. Such a task should not be tied to those kind of shackles. If you enjoy a game or dislike a game, that's fine. It's the opinions that make us human, and disagreement is a good thing, as it keeps us away from those unhealthy echo chambers. If you've learned anything from this video, just remember, perspective is everything. If you guys want to support the channel, you know the drill. Comment, like, share the video, or mess around with the links in the description. Pick your poison and go crazy. And at this point, I said all that I need to. See you next time.